In this video, we're going to talk about one of the most important concepts in logic, validity. We've already begun to approach the subject in previous discussions about entailment, that special relationship that might hold between a set of premises and the conclusion, wherein it would be totally irrational to accept the premises but not the conclusion. Judging whether an argument is valid or not is one of the central goals of philosophical logic, so it's really important to gain a strong understanding of this concept. So let's begin by looking once again at some very simple arguments. New York is east of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is east of Los Angeles. Therefore, New York is east of Los Angeles. Overall, I would say that this is a great argument. It contains all true statements, and it seems to use good reasoning as well. Since being to the east of is a transitive property, just like being taller than, if A is to the east of B and B is to the east of C, then A is to the east of C. Let's just ignore for the time being any complication that arises from the fact that the Earth is round. So it seems like, once again, the premises of this argument entail the conclusion. Now let's consider a different kind of example. Either grass is green or the sky is pink. Grass is not green, therefore the sky is pink. So what about this argument? Is it a good argument? Well, it definitely doesn't seem quite as good as the first argument, since it has an obviously false conclusion. But is it entirely bad? Well, let's see. Suppose you didn't know anything about what color grass is or what color the sky is. Maybe you've been raised in a lab or something and have never seen the light of day. And suppose you just take the information that's stated in the premises for granted. So I'll just assume it's true that either grass is green or the sky is pink. And I'll assume it's true that grass is not green. What you ought to notice is that if you do take those premises as true, then the conclusion that the sky is pink really does follow. So even though it contains some obviously false claims, this argument also exhibits that interesting phenomenon of entailment. If someone were to believe statements 1 and 2, then it would be irrational for them to deny statement 3. Or to put it another way, if 1 and 2 really were true, even though we know they're not, then statement 3 would have to be true as well. So this means that there is something good about the second argument. Although the premises are in reality false, the reasoning that is involved is good. The premises really do entail the conclusion. So this means that the argument is valid. Okay, a valid argument is one in which the premises entail the conclusion. Importantly, it doesn't matter for validity whether the premises are in fact true or false. Validity is simply about whether the conclusion would be true if the premises were true. So, to give a definition, we'll say that a deductive argument is valid just in case if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. Or in other words, it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. So again, notice from this definition that validity does not care about whether the premises are true. Essentially, it just asks us to assume that they're true for the time being and then judge whether the conclusion could be false on that assumption. If the argument's valid, then the conclusion must be true if we assume the premises to be true. So why are we interested in validity anyway? If a valid argument could have a conclusion like the sky is pink, then who really cares about validity? Well, the reason is that validity pertains to the quality of reasoning that's involved in an argument. In logic, we don't really care what color the sky is. That's more a matter of natural science, and logic is supposed to be a bit more abstract somehow. So in logic, for the most part, we don't concern ourselves as much with whether the premises of an argument are in fact true or false. Typically, logicians are more concerned with the reasoning of the argument. And even if you start with bad information, you can still reason well or poorly on the basis of that information. So that's why when we judge validity, we simply assume that the premises are true and then ask ourselves whether the conclusion really follows. Okay, so let's look at a different example. Paris is the capital of France. If Paris is the capital of France, then French is spoken in Paris. Therefore, London is a famous city. What should we say about this argument? On the one hand, you might think it's a pretty good argument. Every statement in the argument is in fact true, so I guess that's a good thing. But what about if we look at the reasoning involved in the argument? Does the conclusion really follow from the premises? It doesn't look that way, right? It seems like the conclusion kind of comes out of nowhere. So what if we apply our definition of validity? Let's just assume that the statements 1 and 2 are true, as they are in fact, and let's also put out of our heads everything we know about European cities. Then, just based on the information in 1 and 2, would it necessarily be the case that London is a famous city? No. There's nothing in statements 1 and 2 that leads you to the conclusion that London is a famous city. So that means it's not impossible for 1 and 2 to be true, but for 3 to be false, which means the argument is not valid. So that's an important observation to make. In the previous example, we saw that an argument can be valid even if most of the premises are in fact false. And here we see that an argument can be invalid even if all of the statements are true. So you should have the sense now that when we talk about validity, we kind of put our worldly knowledge out of our heads and just focus on the information in the argument itself and whether there's a real logical connection between the premises and the conclusion. Okay, so now that we've covered the notion of validity, the notion of soundness should be fairly easy to grasp. Recall that validity simply pertains to the quality of the reasoning involved in an argument, and ignores the question of whether the premises are in fact true or false. Logic is primarily concerned with validity, but since we're judging arguments, in reality we also want to be able to say whether the argument both has good reasoning and uses information that's actually true. So soundness brings back into the picture the question of whether the premises are in fact true or false. Okay, a sound argument is one that's both valid and has true premises. So soundness is simply validity plus true premises. This is in reality the best kind of argument that you can have, right? If you start with true premises and you use valid reasoning, then you're absolutely guaranteed to end up with a true conclusion. And that's because validity is truth preserving. Whenever you perform a valid inference on the basis of true information, you'll end up with a true conclusion as well. So in real life, a sound argument is the best kind of argument you can have, but since deciding whether an argument is sound or not requires knowing whether the premises are true or false, and knowing that often requires worldly information that's outside the realm of logic per se, for the purposes of this class, we'll mostly be judging whether arguments are valid or not. So that being said, a firm understanding of these concepts and how they're related is really crucial for studying logic. Okay, let's just look at one or two more examples for practice. Here's another very simple argument. All fish are mammals. All mammals are cold-blooded. Therefore, all fish are cold-blooded. So take a moment, pause the video if you need to, and decide for yourself whether this argument is valid or invalid, and if it's valid, whether it's also sound. Okay, so is this argument valid? Well, again, if we take the premises for granted, then it does seem that the conclusion would have to be true. If fish are mammals, and mammals are cold-blooded, then fish are cold-blooded. That's a valid chain of reasoning. However, in actual fact, fish are not mammals, and mammals are not cold-blooded. So this argument can't be sound since it has at least one false premise. So this argument is valid but not sound. Alright, let's look at a different argument on the same kind of theme. Whales are mammals. Whales live in the ocean. Therefore, some mammals live in the ocean. So what about this argument? Well, it doesn't seem to contain any false statements, so that's good. And what about the reasoning involved? Does the conclusion follow from the premises? I would say it does. If whales are mammals and whales live in the ocean, then it must be true that some mammals live in the ocean. So I would say this argument is both valid and sound. Okay, so in this video we explored one of the most important notions in philosophical logic, which is the notion of validity. Again, validity is about whether an argument exhibits good reasoning or not. In other words, does the conclusion really follow from the premises? In order to judge validity, we just take the premises for granted, forget all of our knowledge about the world, and see whether the conclusion has to be true under those assumptions. If it does, then the argument is valid. The premises really entail the conclusion. Finally, if an argument is valid and it actually has premises that are in fact true, like true in reality, then it's not only valid, but also sound. So soundness is simply validity plus true premises. And in the next video, we'll look at another way to decide whether an argument is valid or not.